Well, the debate continues, but I've heard it said that New York City migrants, that is, those of us who were born elsewhere but have made our way to this promised land like wide-eyed moths to a sleepless flame, can call ourselves New Yorkers once we have lived here for 20 years. How many New Yorkers are here today? All right, nice. Well, though I am somewhat loath to admit it, this past week, I celebrated the 20-year anniversary of the day my misty-eyed parents plopped me into a dorm room at the intersection of West 60th Street and Amsterdam Avenue, leaving me to fend for myself among the incoming crop of Fordham University fresh people. And over the past 20 years, I have been away from this city for no more than 14 days at a time. I am a new New Yorker. And an anniversary like this one makes one very reflective. I arrived somewhat different than I am today. A lot has changed, a lot has stayed the same. One thing that has remained steadfast is my obsession with death. I read obituaries. I keep up on which celebrities have just left this mortal plane. I scour the internet for their words of wisdom, and this past month was no different. We lost several very bright, very, very human luminaries within a small span. Charlotte Ray kicked things off by proving that death is just one of the facts of life, and she was followed by brilliant womanist theologian, the Reverend Dr. Katie Geneva Cannon, the Queen of Soul, Aretha Franklin, the first openly gay man to ever run for U.S. President, David McReynolds, and former United Nations Secretary General Kofi Annan. This month has brought lots of obituary reading and lots of quotation searches, and that was before Senator John McCain and Robin Leach this weekend. And as I did my searches alongside my celebration of 2 decades in the city, I was reminded of 2 other events that happened 20 years ago, before I moved my entire existence from the heart of America to basically the shoulder of America. The first was an exit meeting with my high school guidance counselor, her last bid to shape me into someone normal, when she called me to her office one final time to tell me that I had a, quote, outsized fascination with death, and that she hoped that I might someday find more hopeful subjects for my attention. I smiled and chuckled, as I had done for the entire 4 years that this sweet guidance counselor had attempted to guide me toward the light and away from the darkness. The second event was the contemporary Christian rock concert that I attended on my final night in Cleveland, Ohio. If you do not know what contemporary Christian music is, be grateful. And basically imagine the sounds of indie rock coupled with the hubris of born-again Christian theology. That night, amidst the cliche melodies and chord progressions, I was told, along with several hundred other young, open-hearted, impressionable fans, that it was my duty to put on the armor of God when I went out into the big, bad world. Our ancient testimony, that Ephesians text about this present darkness, was actually read in its entirety at the concert. Fun stuff. And like the dutiful, armor-bearing, born-again weirdos we were, the entire crowd of us erupted in applause as the preacher-musician got to that final line, "Pray that I may declare it boldly, as I must speak." We were sold. We knew we had armor to wear, a declaration to declare, a truth to speak, And in that communal ecstasy, a young male voice, not mine, called out to the male preacher musician, "I love you!" And that preacher musician, apparently embarrassed by such audacious affection, proceeded to give his entire audience a lecture on how same-sex love is a sin. Fun stuff. You can't make this stuff up. And I ate that stuff up that night. Like some celebrity guidance counselor, that contemporary Christian music star was also trying to guide me into the light and away from the darkness. And then I moved to New York City. And I ran as far as I could from the armor of God and straight into the battlefield of same-sex love. So when today's ancient testimony came up in this week's lectionary text, I basically had a traumatic flashback. And I hemmed and hawed about whether I would use it. And then I realized that if I were having that much trouble deciding if I should use it, I probably definitely should use it. So today, we are looking at the armor of God, the belt of truth, the breastplate of righteousness, the shield of faith, the helmet of salvation, the sword of the Spirit. You doing okay? Because I don't know about you, but my queerly pacifistic tendencies blanch at every one of those militaristic images. One possible solution here, especially for a mostly postmodern, somewhat post-Christian community like ours, might be to avoid the text, to ignore it when it comes around in the lectionary, to say, oh, it was written by Paul, and we kind of collectively agree to not like Paul anyway. But first, it probably wasn't written by Paul. Most scholars now think it's more of a guiding statement of faith from an early network of Christian communities rather than an authentic letter from that old patriarchal prude, Paul. It was probably written decades after Paul died. Second, it's in our scriptures. And if we're going to authentically move our faith into the future, I think it's imperative that we deal with all of Scripture, even the dirty laundry that mucks up our convenient revisionist narratives. And finally, we must remember that this text, when it was written, was the statement of faith of a violently maligned, powerless minority group grasping for existence within a cruel empire. It is a creed of hope for faithful people living on the margins of society. And I would even argue that it's a sort of sly creative writing exercise that takes common, violent, militaristic empire language and recreates it into something a bit more hopeful. But the usefulness of this Ephesians text didn't really click for me until I was catching up this week on the writings of recently departed David McReynolds. McReynolds was not only the first openly gay man to run for president, but he was also a stalwart luminary of the War Resisters League, a staunch pacifist, and a whip-smart, self-critical reflector on history, failure, progress, life, and death. And I met him once before he died when a mutual friend took me over to his East Village apartment for afternoon tea, and it was an awkward meeting, I have to admit. I was self-conscious about my painted nails, which he kept staring at, and I was very self-conscious about my less than deep knowledge about subjects that he knew very, very deeply. And I basically left more in awe of him and more critical of myself. But I also left eager to read any of his writings that I could find. In today's modern testimony, this speech McReynolds gave in this very room is a beacon for me. Strangely, it reads like he just gave it yesterday, complete with reference to our current president, but it was actually delivered way back in 2011, or what some might call the good old days. I find McReynolds' candid self-criticism, his characterization of his lack of courage, his acknowledgement that he simultaneously doesn't know the answers and still constantly seeks them anyway, to be refreshing in a time when admitting to faults, apologizing for selfishness or lack of insight or foresight, or even seeming like you're seeking something close to the truth, are virtues that few of our current leaders are trying to embody. McReynolds' elucidation of death as the great light that helps us keep life in perspective has propelled me through this present darkness, and I think it might have power for all of us. I meet regularly with some of you, and with many others who just happen to stop by the office, and especially over the past 2 years, I would pinpoint the most common feeling that has permeated many of these meetings as grief sessions. Even when someone has not literally died, when these meetings turn to discussion of the current political climate or the state of this country, it often feels like we are talking about something that has died. It often feels like trauma talk. And speaking of trauma talk, a few weeks into my freshman year at Fordham University, 20 years ago, I'll say it proud, I met with my new guidance counselor, a Jesuit priest who had the name of a horror movie demon and the demeanor of a heavenly angel. He asked me what I thought I might gain from my education at Fordham, what my hopes were for my 4 years, and I surprised myself by talking way too much about my high school guidance counselor's obsession with my death obsession, and about my strange night at that Christian rock concert. And I remember he looked at me in this disarmingly intimate way, and I have been in love with Jesuits ever since. And he said, "Perhaps you stay in such close contact with death because it reminds you to appreciate life." And then he said, "No armor of God should come between you and another person. The armor of God must be love, and it must give you hope, and it must encircle us all, or it's not the armor of God. It's just armor." And then he said something that has stayed with me for all of these 20 years, something that has meant more to me over these past 2 years really than anything else. He said, when trauma occurs, when something dies, we have a decision to make between two options. We can destroy, or we can create. And no sermon can give all the answers we desperately crave these days. No service can solve the problems of the world in 1 hour, but what we can do here is approach history and language, violence and culpability, mine the past darkness, interrogate and investigate this present darkness, prepare for future darkness, and choose to create, to remold mistakes, to reshape short-sightedness, selfishness into something new together. The empires of the past have always chosen to destroy. The empires of the past have given us the language for and realities of armor, belts, breastplates, shields, helmets, swords, and so many more tools of destruction. And the empires of today have taken up this violent mantle, exploded their hubris into even greater lengths, and given us new, destructive language and realities. I mean, who ever thought we would seriously be talking about something called a space force that would fight for U.S. space dominance? What even is that? And we are in a current moment where it looks like the destructive power of our present empire is imploding into a self-destructive darkness. This is something to interrogate, something to stay steadfastly interested in. And even as we celebrate the fact that abused power is getting its deadly comeuppance, and even as we fear that the supporters of this abused power might not care and might still just go on supporting it, we are invited to create something different here. We create new language. We create new images for power. We create new ways to give that power to the powerless. We create new options for those who fear that their only choice is destruction. And if you look at your bulletin, we've planted that language, like good church people, into the liturgy right here. Throughout the service in our 5 song titles, you can see it in order: love, vision, peace, hope, respect, walk. What if that letter to the Ephesians had completely replaced that old militaristic language with this language instead? And I'm not talking about flimsy greeting card hallmark language. I'm talking about love and peace and hope that requires vision and demands respect for the powerless and reminds us to walk the walk way beyond the talk. And there's more creative language to be added here. What words and commitments would you add? I want you to think about that. What words and commitments call you to choose creation over destruction? What words and commitments could bubble through this place? Because in here, we are not beyond the destructiveness that's happening out there. How can this place make you more creative? I really want to know. What creative self-reflection could then bubble over the brim of this place out into a world that needs to be taught how to create again? That work begins here. Because I don't think that hopelessness or destruction have ever been real options. And I don't think the real tension here is between darkness and light. It's between destruction and creation. That's why we come here week after week. Of course, it feels like we are grieving a death. We are, all the time, grieving death, literally and metaphorically grieving death. But when we do it in this community, when we put our own hope in the power of a different way, we create something out of that grief. And when we just can't get up the strength to guide ourselves to hope on certain days, there are a few dozen other people who are standing by and who just might be able to guide you in a way that you can't guide yourself. We pick it up when others have to lay it down. We pass the baton, and we trust that they'll carry it for a while when we can't. That's what makes this a service instead of a show. That's what makes this a church instead of a club. This is not entertainment. This is work. Destruction can be easy, and creation never is. And so this morning, we've been guided through love with the help of the Bee Gees. We've sung about vision and peace. And now I want us to guide ourselves towards something like hope. Messy, questionable, inconvenient, but hope nonetheless. The service continues. So Sam and Henko, can you pick up the baton from here?